to the Catholic Forum tonight. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Peter Baltutis, who's going to be speaking on joy and solidarity, Pope Francis' vision for Catholicism in Evangelii Gaudium. And Peter comes to us, he is a late Dominican, so we're thrilled about that, and he comes to us from Toronto. He did his PhD in history of Christianity at the University of St. Michael's College, and he came out here last July 1st to teach religious studies and theology at Corpus Christi College. So we welcome Peter tonight.
Wonderful, thank you. So, first of all, it's my great honor and privilege to be here tonight. I want to thank all the Dominicans that invited me to come here this evening. As Kathy mentioned, I am a late Dominican in formation, so tonight I'm here amongst family, so thank you for having me. Secondly, I want to start off really emphasizing as clearly and as boldly and as loudly as I can that very simply, my presentation tonight about Pope Francis' apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, should not replace your reading of the text. This document is exceptionally clearly presented, written in a way that's accessible to all people, regardless of your education level. You don't need to have a PhD like I have to read this document. So tonight, rather than having me explain this document to you, hopefully I can simply whet your appetite for more. For you to go out, for you to buy it, get it online, the cost is free. So I encourage you to try and find this document, and hopefully tonight will make you want to read this document. That's my goal for tonight. I'm encumbered by lots of wires tonight, so I apologize for that. So first of all, the topic for tonight is called Joy in Solidarity. Pope Francis' vision for Catholicism in Evangelii Gaudium. This document is exceptionally broad in its scope, but in many ways there's multiple times in which he makes reference to these two key themes, joy and solidarity. These are but two themes that come across clearly in this document, and I think these two themes are the two themes that Pope Francis wants all of us to carry forward into our own lives. And these are the two keys, I believe, he sees the church boldly proclaiming to the world. And these two themes are simply joy and solidarity. We begin first with a quick story. About a month ago, I was flying through the Vancouver airport. And while I was waiting for my flight, which of course was delayed, I happened to cross the newsstand. And I saw these two magazines staring back at me. One of them, Time magazine. The other one, more surprisingly, Rolling Stone. Two magazines that don't often talk about Catholicism, or if they do, it's not always in the most flattering light. But here they are, putting Pope Francis on their covers. So there's something about this Pope, something about his personality, his message, that's transcending Catholicism, that's reaching out to the secular audience and making people take notice. So what is this message? Tonight I want to try and unpack that a little bit for you. So tonight we're talking about his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, which in English translates to the joy of the gospel. This is the first extensive piece of writing that Francis has done as Pope. A bit of background about why he wrote it. Well, he wrote the new document in response to the October 2012 Synod of Bishops on the new evangelization. Curiously, oftentimes after the Synod of Bishops meets, their notes are sent to the Pope, who compiles them, and then puts his own stamp on it, and then issues it out to the lay faithful and the whole church. However, Pope Francis consciously decided to ignore the notes of the bishop, and he wrote this document almost exclusively on his own. So it's penned in his own hand. But the theme is the same, evangelization. Basically, how do we witness and give expression and life to the message of the gospel in the year 2014, here in Vancouver? Pope Francis gives us a very loud and clear message. It begins right at the beginning of his document. He talks to us and says that the joy of the gospel, this message of trying to proclaim, this theme of evangelization for him says that all the baptized, whatever their position in the church, or the level of instruction of the faith, are agents of evangelization. And it would be insufficient to envisage a plan of evangelization to be carried out by the professionals, while the rest of the faithful would simply be passive recipients. This new evangelization calls for personal involvement on the part of each of the baptized. Every Christian, so all of us, me, you, every Christian is challenged here and now to be actively engaged in evangelization. Indeed, anyone who has truly experienced God's saving love does not need much time or lengthy training to go out and proclaim that love. Every Christian is a missionary to the extent that he or she has encountered the love of God in Christ Jesus. We no longer say that we are disciples and missionaries, but rather that we are always missionary disciples. So loud and clear, right from the beginning, he's speaking to all people, not just to bishops or priests or deacons, but to every person, me and you. He's speaking to us here, and in this very document, he's trying to connect with all of us. In this document, he's calling upon all people to be these agents of evangelization. When he does so, is he begins the document, point number 1, very clearly, this idea that the joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of all who encounter Jesus. Those who accept his offer of salvation are set free from sin, sorrow, inner emptiness, and loneliness. With Christ, joy is constantly born anew. In this exhortation, I wish to encourage the Christian faithful to embark upon a new chapter of evangelization marked by this joy, while pointing out new paths for the church's journey in years to come. So we see this idea of joy he's referencing. And that's the first point of my talk tonight. How do we proclaim this message? We do it with joy. Simple as that. Towards the end of the document, he hammers it home once again. The primary reason for evangelizing is the love of Jesus, which we have received, the experience of salvation which urges us to even ever greater love of him. What kind of love would not feel the need to speak of the beloved, to point him out, to make him known? If we do not feel an intense desire to share this love, we need to pray incessantly that he will once more touch our hearts. We need to implore his grace daily, asking him to open our cold hearts and shake up our lukewarm and superficial existence. So in many ways, he wants us to proclaim this message joyfully. He wants all of us to be shaken out of our apathy, to go out and be touched with fresh ears and fresh eyes to hear this message and bring it forward. Francis, in this document, as I said earlier, he makes it as simple as he possibly can. And he speaks, to quote the famous Latin phrase from Cardinal Newman, speaks heart to heart, his heart to your heart. And as he speaks, he says very clearly, in very blunt language, quote, an evangelizer must never look like someone who has just come back from a funeral. If we're going out trying to proclaim a message of joy, we have to be joyful people. That's the challenge. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes not so easy. So let's unpack this idea of joy a little bit more deeply. Theme 1, joy. How many of us are joyful for the message? How many of us are jumping for joy at the message? As Kathy mentioned, I teach at Corpus Christi College, the Catholic Liberal Arts College here in Vancouver on the campus of UBC. And right now, my undergraduate students are reading a book by the great Dominican teacher and preacher Timothy Radcliffe. Radcliffe has a book entitled, What is the Point of Being a Christian? And I'll save you 300 pages and tell you, he says very clearly, hope. We live in a time where the world lacks hope. We live in a time where the world lacks meaning. Radcliffe Catholic says, as Christians, we have a sense of meaning. We have a sense of hope. We know where we came from in our baptism. We know where we're going to be reunited with God once again. We know how the story ends. We are an Easter people. This should bring us joy. Our job is to carry that joy out to the world. And sometimes, dare I say, even out to our fellow Catholics, who sometimes have forgotten the simple joy of the gospel message. The word gospel literally means good news. This news is good. The Catholic Church, the gospel, the teachings of Christ, this is the greatest message of all time. We are free from sin. God calls us to be reunited back with Him. This message of self-sacrificial love of Christ dying for us, this should bring us joy. If this doesn't make that innermost part of you get excited and turned on and happy about the faith, we have to look closely at what this message is about. This should inspire us. So a few more words about joy. This joy does not come from words or doctrines. It comes from the living God. In particular, the gift of Christ. God's gift of God's self to humanity. That's what it stems from. As the image up here depicts, and as I hinted at earlier, we are an Easter people. We live in the light of the knowledge of the resurrection, and this should bring us a sense of hope and joy. If Christ is for us, who can be against us? Pope Francis begins by talking about this idea that everything in this exhortation revolves around the Pope's passionate desire to foster a joy-filled encounter with the crucified and risen Christ. He begins by saying that the Church's message begins by going back to the basics. I've been through numerous years of theological study where we're trying to rethink the wheel, how to repackage what we're doing, how to sell it to young people, how to make it presentable to a way that's hip and modern. But Francis says, as important as these focus groups are, the further we get from the message of the gospel, the further we'll go away from the actual joy of the gospel. So we start and begin with joy. And he says the Church's message has to concentrate on the essentials, on what is most beautiful, most grand, most appealing, and at the same time, most necessary. So back to basics. He continues to say, in this basic core, what shines forth is the beauty of the saving love of God made manifest in Jesus Christ, who died and rose from the dead. That's where we start, with this message of joy. So, if we understand and accept this Easter message, that Christ has overcome and risen from the dead, this now compels us to go forward. So what do we do with this message? Well, for Pope Francis, it affects everything. Specifically, he says that this idea of Catholics, and he's talking to us, Catholics oftentimes, sometimes even priests, sometimes even deacons, sometimes even bishops, sometimes even popes. He talks about the fact that sometimes these Catholics, they get involved in a sense of acting as if God did not even exist. They make decisions as if the poor did not exist. Setting goals as if others did not exist. Working as if people who have not received the gospel did not exist. In many ways, he wants us to re-evaluate our faith. Look at it with fresh eyes. Are we preaching and living out the faith in a way that's joyful? And if it's not, we have to go back and reassess it. I'm getting very vague. Let's make it more concrete in particular. Now, forewarning. There's lots of different learning styles. For me, I self-identify as a visual learner. So I like to use lots of images in my presentations. But to make this work most effectively, I need your help. I'm going to show you an image I would like someone here to raise their hand and tell us what they see in this image. I'll give you a few moments. Okay, we see two fish. What is between those two fish? This exercise doubles as a seeing eye test. What's between those two fish? Not all at once. Close. Not exactly a fishing line, but you're right with the whole nautical, maritime imagery there. It's actually meant to be an anchor. There's an anchor between those two fish. Ah, now that I say it, you see it. Yes. This symbol of the anchor is one of our earliest symbols of Christianity we have. This stone in particular comes from the catacombs in Rome. So the earliest imagery we have, surprisingly, is not of the cross, not of the crucifix, which was seen as a symbol of defeat, the death of Jesus, but rather fish. But I want to focus here on the anchor. This symbol of the anchor spoke to the earliest followers and told them that anything you do, say, preach, teach must be anchored, rooted in the gospel message. Once we start going too far afield, like a ship without an anchor, we begin drifting off and drifting away. This idea that the joy of the gospel for Francis begins and lies with the primacy of the crucified and risen Christ. It's from this basic truth, this tenet, this doctrine, this dogma of faith, that our evangelization must begin from. We can't trick people into becoming Christians. It begins with the bold proclamation of this simple message. A long quote I know. The good Francis says, "A true missionary, which we're all called to be, who never ceases to be a disciple, knows that Jesus walks with him, speaks to him, breathes with him, works with him. He senses Jesus alive with him in the midst of the missionary enterprise. Unless we see him present at the heart of our missionary commitment, our enthusiasm soon wanes, and we're no longer sure of what it is that we are handing on. We begin to lack vigor and passion. A person who is not convinced, enthusiastic, certain, and in love will convince nobody." So at the beginning, if we're called to be evangelizers, it begins with us first falling in love once again with the gospel message. Now recently, I have a 6-year-old daughter, and we were practicing teaching her the Our Father. And recently, I realized I can say the Our Father in 8 seconds. I can rattle it off without even thinking about it. And a lot of times as Catholics, we have this almost muscle memory of saying prayers and responding back. And we don't actually hear the words anymore. One of the pastors lived and worked in Toronto, he used to intentionally ask lectors. He chose lectors where English was not their native language. So that people in the congregation would really have to listen carefully to the words that the lector was reading. So the challenge for us is to try and listen once again to this message with fresh ears and to fall in love once again with this gospel message. He continues to say this idea that Jesus Christ loves you. He gave up his life to save you, and now he's living at your side every day to enlighten, to strengthen, and to free you. Some of us, myself included, sometimes we forget this simple truth. Francis is calling us back to remember these simple, bold, prophetic statements of Christianity. Now, foreshadow. What he also does is this idea where he begins to talk about, and this is where the language is really interesting. He says that there are certain Catholics who have certain roadblocks. He says there are certain Catholics that are challenged with, in his words, quote, complacency, quote, excessive clericalism, and my favorite, quote, even Catholics who act like sourpusses. That's the actual Vatican translation, sourpusses. As a church historian, the first time to my knowledge the word sourpusses appears in the official church document. But this, as he says, what we don't want. I'll give you a brief example. I mentioned I have children at home. When my daughter was first born, I have a son also who's 2 years younger. I have two brothers, one older, one younger, both loving, generous uncles. One of those uncles is extremely expressive. Every time he sees his niece and nephew, he lights up with a smile. The other uncle, equally loving, but is much more reserved. So, he oftentimes, while generous, was more dour. And it was interesting to see, almost as an experiment, with these two young children. They're always drawn to, can you guess which uncle? The uncle who's smiling. The uncle who gives them hugs and kisses. That's what they're drawn to. Much the same way when we go out and proclaim this message, we have to do it with joy. Not being complacent and not being sourpusses. That's step number one. Theme one is joy. Theme two. Pope Francis talks about the dream of a church that, his word is, quote, a church who is poor and for the poor. Has anyone ever seen this image before at all? Okay. One person? All right. If nothing else, then I'm happy to show you this image. This is a woodcut that was done for members of the Catholic worker movement. Dorothy's Days movement was founded in New York City back in the 1930s. It still operates. This is called Christ of the Breadlines. So you see here people lined up on line for some soup or some bread. They're cold, huddled for warmth. In the center there you can see the figure of Christ with the nimbus, the halo around him. Francis is telling us, which is graphically depicted here in this woodcut by Fritz Eichenberg, is the idea that every person we encounter who's poor or in need, that's where we see Christ. If we've forgotten to enjoy the gospel, we've forgotten what Christ looks like, look to the poor. That's where we experience Christ most intimately. So our second theme tonight, the first was joy, the second is solidarity. Francis wants and tells us time and time again in this document that he as a pope, as a Christian, as a Catholic, is inspired by Jesus' poverty and Jesus' concern for the dispossessed during Christ's earthly ministry. Pope Francis calls for a church which is poor and for the poor. Now, he says, quote, "The poor have much to teach us," he writes. "We are called to find Christ in them, to lend our voices to their causes, but also to be their friends, to listen to them, to speak for them, and to embrace the mysterious wisdom which God wishes to share with us through them." Has anyone ever seen this icon before? All right. Once again, my joy to share this great imagery with you. Could someone tell me, raise your hand, what do you see in this icon of Christ? Raise your hand. Yes, sir. Yeah, so we see the stigmata on his hand, the wounded Christ. You know it's definitely Christ. He has the nimbus around him. And by the way, anytime you ever see Christian iconography, We know it's Christ because he has the nimbus, but lots of saints have nimbuses or halos behind them. Only Christ will ever have the crucifix behind them, inside of that halo. What this one does, we know it's Christ. As he points out, it's the stigmata on his hands. We know it's the wounds of the crucified Christ. How is Christ depicted in this icon? All right. I hear nondescript mumbling. Someone to raise their hand and clearly tell us what they're seeing here? Yes, sir, in the back.
A prisoner.
Okay, Jesus as a prisoner. Jesus behind barbed wires, being imprisoned. So, this icon is saying we have to see Christ in those who are imprisoned, those who are suffering, those who are trapped. Or, is maybe, rather than Jesus behind barbed wire, maybe we're the ones behind barbed wire. And Jesus is the one who's showing us the way to freedom. I see a few knowing smiles now. This icon is meant to challenge our perspective. That's what Francis wants to do. What is it about the poor? We don't look at them as a nuisance. We don't look at them with pity or sorrow. He says very clearly, the poor have much to teach us. We're called to see and experience how Christ speaks to us in their situation. This idea that how do we work with them? Well, Francis says we help them through charity is good, but that's not enough. What he's saying is that charity is more than mere handouts. Quote, it means working to eliminate the structural causes of poverty and to promote the integral development of the poor. Now, as I mentioned, I have 2 small children. Now, every morning, my son who's 4, and he'll love watching this on YouTube one day, my son who is 4, nearly every morning, like clockwork, at breakfast, inevitably spills his milk. It drives me up the wall. Doesn't matter how many times we tell him, how many times we try and correct him, inevitably has his cup of milk, loves it, drinks it, spills it. Once he spills the milk, the charity approaches, seeing as a problem, grabbing a towel, quickly cleaning it up before it spills or spreads across the table or the floor. We mop up the problem, take care of the immediate need. That's a charity-based approach. You see a need, you respond to it. Person's hungry, give them some food. Person's homeless, give them a place to be that's warm and secure. Francis is talking about is moving away from mere handouts to engaging now the underlying structural causes, the justice approach. In the case of my son spilling his milk, the justice approach would be, rather than mopping it up, it'd be instructing him that if he puts his glass always on the edge of the table, it will fall. But teaching him to put it squarely and firmly on the table. Proactively teaching him how to ensure that the cup does not spill again. That's the difference between charity and justice. Equally good. Pope Benedict writes about in his great typical Caritas Veritate, charity and justice are equally good. Francis is saying, simply by engaging in charity, it's not enough. We look at the underlying root causes. He continues to say this idea that what is justice? Well, that means education, access to health care, and above all, employment, for it's through free, creative, participatory, and mutually supportive labor that human beings express and enhance the dignity of their lives. This is what we're being called and challenged to do. Not simply meeting needs, but trying to understand what are the structural challenges that are making these people poor in the first place. Working towards not simply feeding hungry stomachs, but allowing them to have meaningful employment that provides dignity to their lives. That's what we're called to work for. He continues to say about this idea, he adds, quote, "The worst discrimination which the poor suffer is the lack of spiritual care. They need God, but we must not fail to offer them his friendship, his blessing, his word, the celebration of the sacraments, and a journey of growth and maturity in faith." It's the idea that people are not simply lacking in this world because of material needs. There's a deeper spiritual problem. When Mother Teresa was first brought to the United States, I was on a speaking tour. She was in Boston. And while she was up there, they asked her, "You spent your life, Mother Teresa, working in Calcutta, literally pulling people who are dying out of the gutter, seeing probably the most extreme forms of poverty. Now here you are in the land of opportunity, USA, where metaphorically the streets are paved with gold. What do you think of Boston?" Her response, "I've never seen a place so poor in all my life." Mother Teresa, have you not seen our skyscrapers, our boulevards, nice cars? She says, no. We're not talking about the idea of people being poor. Mother Teresa says it's a spiritual poverty. Now, I grew up in New York City. In New York City, we have one of the world's great subway systems. But you're taught at a very young age, when you're on the subway, you look two places. You look up, you look down. You don't dare make eye contact with who's right in front of you. We're taught not to see people. We're taught to purposely ignore people. And that's what Jesus is talking about. We're not seeing people or recognize them even as humans. Francis picks this up and says, when we see the poor, we have to see them as people. Don't see them as a problem, see them as people. And we're called to share with them that joy we mentioned earlier. We share that joy with them. That's what we're called to do. Now, a couple years ago, I was in Toronto during one of our very cold winters, which I'm very happy that we don't quite have the same depth of cold that we have in Toronto. Snow and wind and sleet and hail and all kinds of biblical plagues crashing down upon you for months on end. At least this year's out. But in Toronto once, I was at one of the grocery stores. And I'm waiting online to buy a few small items. And I'm there at the cashier. And I'm waiting behind 2 or 3 people. I notice the cashier is talking to those in front of me online. And they're talking about something outside. So I kind of look around the corner. What are they talking about? There's a dog out there. Now outside it's probably a good -20. Wind chill probably closer to -30. And they're saying, oh my God, there's a dog out there, freezing, shivering. Should we bring the dog inside? Should we offer the dog something to drink? Should we give the dog a blanket to keep warm? And of course my heart goes out to see the animal suffering is terrible. But when I look out there, I realize that there's a dog out there shivering, but next to it are its 2 owners. Also cold, also shivering. No discussion about bringing them inside. No discussion about giving them something warm to eat. There's almost this kind of judgment that somehow poor people have failed in life or somehow deserve their lot in life. Francis is saying we can't have that approach. We have to look at them as people and share with them this joy as well. Not only do we bring the gospel to them, but as the earlier quote showed you, we're called to see and experience Christ through that relationship with them as well. I'm very lucky and privileged that every 2 weeks at Corpus Christi College, we bring a group of about 15 undergraduate students to the downtown east side. We serve hot chocolate with some marshmallows and whipped cream. Our students make sandwiches that we hand them out on the street. On one level, we go downtown, we offer some sandwiches, we offer a warm cup of hot chocolate, and they appreciate it. But more importantly, we tell our students, you're not giving hot chocolate, you're giving yourself. You hand to them, look them in the eye, engage them in conversation, get to know them. A couple weeks ago, we bought some board games. And I fancy myself a pretty decent chess player. About a month ago, we're down there, and there's one person who comes up with the most ragged clothes. He comes up, and within about 5 minutes, he's defeated all of the faculty and all the students at chess, effortlessly. The breadth and depth of this guy's mind, brilliant person, someone who, honestly, I probably would look the other way. When we start talking to him, this is a person who has a university education, but because of mental health issues and addiction issues, now finds himself on the streets. A beautiful soul, who I was very privileged to have a chance to interact with. So we walk past the four, don't see for who they are, we miss the gift of God speaking to us through them. Francis wants to emphasize very clearly, he critiques this idea of the poor and how we treat the poor. And he continues to say, who are the poor? It's not just materially poor. The poor are anyone who are vulnerable. They're not able to speak up for themselves. And he mentions here, quote, the idea of the unborn children. People who are most defenseless and innocent among us, whose defense is, quote, closely linked to the defense of each and every human right. What he's saying here is that every person, this is the bedrock of Catholic moral theology, every single person is created, as we say in Latin, imago Dei, in the image and likeness of God. Every person, by the mere fact they're alive, is sacred and is blessed. And we have to protect and honor that dignity. Whether it's unborn, whether it's those that are homeless, or those who suffer with mental health issues, everyone needs to be treated with dignity. And we're called to share that joy of the gospel with them, and also see how Christ is speaking to us through them once again. So all of these are sacred, because it's time I'll just keep moving along here. This idea, though, that our faith is something that is important. It's our faith in Christ who became poor and was always close to the poor and the outcast is the basis of our concern for the integral development of society's most neglected members. Why do we work with the poor? Because if we're Christians, we're called to do what Christ did. And on earth, that's who Christ went to. The sick, the poor, the lepers, the outcasts, the prostitutes, the sinners. We can't close our churches off to those people. Those are the people that need our help in this joyful message the most. That's who we're called to reach out to. And he says this lack of solidarity with these people, a lack of solidarity towards his or her needs, will directly affect our relationship with God. This is what the church needs, is this kind of prophetic voice. The way we engage people, say the downtown east side, or those even outside here on Joy Street. If we're neglecting the poor, we're neglecting our relationship with God. The two are intimately linked. You can't worship God and ignore the needs of our brothers and sisters around us. You can't even claim to be a Christian, he'll continue. You can't say, quote, I love God, and then hate your brother. That person's a liar. For the one who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. That comes from the letter of John. This idea that we cannot be indifferent to those around us. And that's why the second thing I want to give you tonight is solidarity. We're called to be connected to all people. Our relationship with these people also affects our relationship with God. We can't have one without the other. This idea now, I think we look at the huge corpus of Catholic social teaching, which is the area of my academic research. The one unique contribution that Francis makes here is what he's saying is not new so far. This is the message that Christ proclaimed. It was reaffirmed by the patristic church fathers, continued the tradition of Aquinas in the Middle Ages, brought forward up through modern Catholic social teaching, beginning in 1891 with Rerum Novarum, through all the popes, through Vatican II's Gaudium et Spes, all the way up through Benedict. The message isn't new, but Francis wants to highlight, and perhaps it takes the experience of someone coming from the global south. He wants to highlight the idea here that participation is key. It's not simply giving them money in a paternalistic way, but it's engaging and involving them in their own way of being part of society. We have to include them. And he says that poverty is exclusion. And quote, those excluded are no longer society's underside or its fringes or its disenfranchised. They're no longer even part of it. They are excluded and not the exploited, but the outcasts, the leftovers. In other words, the ultimate violation of human dignity is no longer seeing them as people, ignoring them. Our response must be to include, to be inclusive of people. Participation is key. So justice is participation. The idea that inclusion means inviting the poor to participate in the world's economic, social, political, cultural systems as full partners, building up their capabilities so that they can take their deserved seat at the table for all as equals, so that economic exchanges will be mutually beneficial and that the politics will involve real partnerships. So Francis is challenging us to not simply give handouts to the poor, but to welcome them into conversations of how we work towards justice. We're not doing for them, we should be doing with them. Justice as participation. And Francis says very clearly, I prefer a church who is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out in the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and cling to its own security. The idea that we're called to enter into the messiness of this struggle by having solidarity with these people and helping them to raise themselves out of their situation. Journeying with them, not doing for them, but journeying with them. So in many ways, Evangelii Gaudium places the work of the church squarely in the camp of social justice. Now, as I walked in tonight, I saw out front a table talking about the current campaign coming up on behalf of the Canadian Catholic Organization for Development and Peace. This organization was founded by the Catholic bishops in 1967 as a direct response to the challenge to work towards justice. The Canadian bishops, as call came to them in Vatican II, with the promulgation of the document Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution of the Church in the modern world. And as a response, the Catholic bishops created this new organization. And this organization is still active in the world. And one of the hallmarks of DNP is the work of participation. Helping people in the global south, seeing what are their needs, what are their goals, and helping them accomplish it. It's working in partnership. Not paternalism doing for people, but partnership and solidarity working with people. So for Francis, who draw to a close, all of us are invited to be joyful, to work in solidarity, and to live out, quote, an authentic faith, which is never comfortable or completely personal, and always involves a deep desire to change the world, to transmit values, and leave this earth somehow better than we found it. How do we do that? We do that through joy. How do we do that? We do that by experiencing Christ through the poor, being in solidarity with them, learning from them, and then working with them. Joy and solidarity. These are two things that Pope Francis is challenging us to do. He leaves us with a bit of a haunting quote here at the end. This idea that it's not enough simply to say that God loves the poor in a special way and leave it at that. That's not enough. We must be vigilant in our care. We must be vigilant in our advocacy for them. And everyone must do this, says the Pope. And this is the haunting quote here, the challenge for all of us, tonight and as we go forward. Quote, none of us can think we are exempt from concern for the poor and social justice. None of us. So try and wrap this all up together very clearly. Francis believes that mission, spreading the gospel, proclaiming the gospel, the new evangelization, this is central to the Catholic faith. We're all called to engage in it together. Me as a theologian, bishops, priests, religious brothers and sisters, permanent deacons, lay people, all of us and brothers and sisters are to share in this task. Evangelization is not the work just of missionaries. We're all called to do it. How do we do it? We do it by proclaiming the gospel message purely and simply with joy. We're called to fall in love again with that message. And once we understand it, we live it, and we love it, we share it joyfully, but we go out to all people. Not just the wealthy, they need the message, but so do the poor. We have to work for the poor, be in solidarity with the poor, and through that work we will experience and see Christ through that solidarity. So this message, this exhortation from Pope Francis, calls upon all of us to actively engage in this mission, which is central to being a Christian and a Catholic. And this ends, in a sense, the Gospel of Matthew, where Matthew clearly says, at the end of his Gospel, go forth and make disciples of all nations. That's the challenge Francis is saying to us in a new way. We're called to go out and share this message, radically, boldly, and joyfully. Thank you very much.